Good morning. I hope this all finds you healthy and happy. It's Saturday morning here, and hopefully you'll look at this Monday. Here again, I'm well dressed, intelligently dressed, as you can see, if I can get this camera centered. Here's what we're looking at today. We're looking at food webs. We looked at them the other day, right? Producers, consumers, decomposers, now we'll add them. The pathway of energy transfer through trophic levels. That now becomes the topic today. Trophic levels and how they connect to food webs. Um, the reduction of available, that's a key word, available energy at successive energy levels, that's something we're going to focus on here today. All right, so here we go. This says a lot. This diagram has lots of arrows. One thing you notice is that these boxes now are going to represent a whole bunch of different kinds of producers in that case that might be listed separately on a food web. So this is very similar though, right? What's this say? It says these things are eating those things. These things are sending things. I wish that would get out of the way. These things are sending things to those things. Okay, so it's very much like a food web, except now we have just separate boxes to designate all the primary consumers, secondary consumers, so on and so forth. We also have different colored arrows. They're obviously different colored for a different reason, and you'll notice that the red dotted line arrows, they only go from one thing to another, whereas the blue arrows go from one thing to another, but then they also go back to where they started. This is a big idea in ecology. We talked about what doesn't ever get back to where it starts is energy, which is what the red arrows represent. Energy that's chemical, except this energy, right, is solar energy. Energy that's chemical in chemical bonds, but what does go back to where it started are those chemicals themselves. And specifically then, what this blue arrow represents that goes back to the producers is carbon dioxide and water, right? Along with some other minerals and things, but those molecules that were the result of respiration, right? What does this represent? This represents photosynthesis happening with that solar energy, and the energy in those molecules now is being sent to all other levels of the food chain. All right, so we have here another term, detritus. That means dead stuff. And why they needed this box, right, to represent dead things. Notice all these things connect to that box, but they're just dead secondary consumers, primary consumers, and so forth. And what it represents, though, is that you have another group of organisms that are going to feed on these dead things, break down their molecules, and send them back to plants. These are the things that eat dead things, but these are the things that we have collectively called decomposers before. The bacteria, bacteria and fungi are main among them. However, you know this too, right? Let's say you're this secondary consumer, right? When you eat and chop up organic molecules doing Krebs cycles and glycolysis and that stuff, you also send these molecules back to producers when you exhale. So you really should have these blue lines coming from every box back to the primary producers. Okay, so that gives us the trophic level. Trophic is feeding, the trophic level idea. And now we have this. Here's the available energy thing. And so here we have a caterpillar that's eating some plant material. So we have a primary consumer, right? A primary producer. This is the what happens to your lunch story once again, right? What happens to your lunch? Well, some of the molecules in your lunch you do glycolysis Krebs cycle stuff with. You recharge your ATPs. That represents a certain part of your lunch. Some part of your lunch you can't do anything with because you can't digest it, right? You call this waste. We'll come back to that in a little bit, right? But some part of your lunch, represented here, actually becomes part of you, right? Some of these plant molecules are now caterpillar molecules. How much? Well, in this particular specific mathematical example, of the 200 joules, that's an energy unit, worth of organic molecules that the caterpillar ate, 33 of them actually became part of the caterpillar's body. Now that equals 16.5%, right? Which is not 10%, but this 10% is an average, and it's called the 10% rule, right? How much of your lunch becomes part of you? About 10%. How much of your lunch do you use, though, is more than 10%, right? Because you use this part, it just didn't become part of you. What happened to it? You chopped it up and spit out the pieces. What are they? Carbon dioxide and water, as well as some other things, right? But we focused on mostly carbon dioxide and water. So there's the reduction in available energy. What does that mean? Let's look at this one. So this is really called a pyramid, but it's a glorified bar graph. Each one of these bars, now horizontally, represents a certain amount. That's why this bar is bigger than this bar. How much bigger? About 10 times bigger. So they've taken the average of 10% idea, and again, this is an energy pyramid, right? These units here are joules. They're measuring the energy in the chemicals that are parts of the bodies of these members of a food chain or food web, right? Primary producer, consumers, consumers, consumers. So what's the 10% rule say? That the grasshopper only uses 10% of the plant that it eats? No. It says that however much plant it eats, only 10% of it becomes part of its body. That means for the mouse that eats it, the mouse is in essence only getting about 10% of this plant, because that's all that's stuck with the grasshopper that it ate. There's the reduction. The 10% reduction is felt like 2 levels up in the food chain. So now we look at it this way. Now we get a little different kind of thing. This is not about food and the energy in their molecules. These are about molecules that are toxic. But also importantly here, these molecules are not easy to break down and spit out. They stick in your body or whoever's body, right? Because they're also fat soluble. Because if they were water soluble, then they would be able to be dissolved and you would pass them out like in your urine or in your sweat. But they're fat soluble, so they stick with you in fatty tissues and, as we'll talk about, nervous tissue, nerve cell tissue that's part fat, and cell membranes, right, that you know are phospholipid fat. So here's what happens to them. They don't get reduced as they go up the food chain. They get concentrated. They get magnified. This biological magnification can be shown in this little thing, which is a little confusing because of this reason. Here you have the idea. The chemical they feature here is called DDT. It's a pesticide. It's a famous human story of learning lessons the hard way. DDT was a pesticide that was produced for all the right intentions, specifically to kill mosquitoes that were transmitting malaria. That was the big push to develop this. This is in the 1950s, or maybe 40s, but 50s, I think, 60s, when this was used worldwide, especially in those tropical areas where malaria was a problem, and it saved millions of human lives by killing those mosquitoes. But then as time went by, we started to learn the downside of that story. So if you'll use this graph here, these little dots represent DDT molecules that get incorporated into the bodies of plants and algae in the water, for instance. And when these little guys, these would be primary consumers, when they eat a whole bunch of those little algae things or plants, they get a little dose of something that they can't break down and that sticks in their fatty tissues and their cell membranes. And so the concentration increases. If you're a little fish and in your life you eat thousands of these things, you get a dose of that chemical from each one that you can't break down and that sticks with you. So the concentration in your little body is a lot greater than it is in these things. This is the magnification part. What this little chart is a little confusing is that they made an energy kind of pyramid that shows that reduction in chemical energy up the food chain. But if you see all these numbers, they're getting bigger. And the way it works is that a little bit of poison is not enough to hurt you, but magnified in the food chain, this is where we started seeing the problems. In the higher levels of the food chain, where this was straight away killing some kinds of top predators, but also affecting such things as in these birds, their egg laying and so forth. And this is what we started to see and said, ooh, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't use this chemical. Let's make it against the law, but then we simply replaced it with other pesticides that have the same problem. This is a continuing problem in trying to keep people safe from infectious disease that are carried by insects, and to keep people eating where insects eat a lot of food stuff that we grow for ourselves. This is the biological magnification story. It involves the food chain and food webs. Therefore, it's connected with the trophic level stuff and with the ecology stuff, but it's quite a different phenomenon. These chemicals increase as you go up the food chain, whereas available energy decreases as you go up the food chain. Capiche?